Welcome to the training videos of the poultry practice. My name is Darren Petty and I will be presenting a series of videos on pest control. The aim of this presentation is to introduce the concept of effective pest control on poultry farms. The first presentation will deal with rodent control. So why do we have such problems with rodents? Why do we want not to see rodents on poultry farms? Well, rodents consume very large amounts of feed and spoil even more feed. The average Norway rat eats about 15 to 20 grams of feed a day, and a severe infestation can easily have 5,000 rats on a farm. And if you do the maths, you'll see that that's 75 kilograms of feed per day that they're eating, and that doesn't include that feed which is spoiled because of the urine and feces that they leave. They also destroy infrastructure. They chew wires, causing short circuits that can cause fires. They destroy curtains. They destroy roof insulation. They are really extremely destructive. And most importantly, they're associated with over 45 different diseases, which include salmonellosis, colibacillosis, coryza, pasteurella, mycoplasma, hemorrhagic enteritis, and numerous worms. So it's important to control diseases that are associated with rodents, and the only way to do that is to control the rodents themselves. So how do you know you have a problem with rodents? Many people assume they have no problem with rodents since they don't see them. But rodents need to be looked for. So there are some rules of thumb that we go by. If you only see signs of rodents but no actual rodents, and the signs would be evidence that bait has been chewed or that there's scat, then the chances are that there are about 1 to 100 rats on a farm, which is a low infestation. Once you start seeing rodents at night and more signs of rodents, you can estimate about 50 to 100 rats in the house. When nightly sightings are common, and there are even occasional daytime sightings, you're looking at about 500 to 2,000 rats in the house. And when you start to see several rats during the day, your estimated infestation rate is about 5,000 rats in the house. For every rat that you see, there are about 20 to 50 rats that you don't see. So you can see that a problem can easily arise and needs to be dealt with. So there are 3 different types of rodents that are important in the context of poultry houses. There are the 2 rats, the roof rat and the Norway rat, and then the mice. If we look at the differences between the Norway rat and the roof rat, the Norway rat is a much bigger rat. It tends to have a tail that's shorter than its body, and it tends to have a very stumpy face. The feces are more capsule-like with rounded ends. The roof rat, on the other hand, is a bit slender, has a long tail, a tail that's actually longer than the body, a more pointy nose and biggish ears. The little droppings are pointy at the ends and they tend to be quite small. The Norway rat is a burrowing rat, so it tends to live in burrows under the ground. In the context of the poultry house, in high-rise houses with manure pits, it tends to burrow into manure and is very happy to live there. And you will find where there's large amounts of manure that the Norway rat population is almost uncontrolled. The roof rat, as the name indicates, tends to live higher up and tends to not run along the ground, but tends to run along the rafters. Aside from that, they are fairly similar. They both have astonishing reproductive capacities. They both eat much the same thing. They're both dependent on water, which is an important thing to know as far as when one wants to control their numbers. On the other side, we see a mouse, a much smaller little animal. They can be just as problematic in the context of a poultry house. They tend to be quite inquisitive, so they will investigate rodent traps and different baits. They are not that dependent on liquid, so it's really not very helpful to give them to have liquid baits around. Whereas with both the rats, they are quite dependent on water, so they it can be quite helpful to provide a water source if you're wanting to get them to eat poison. Rodents need feed, water, and shelter. By depriving them of any one of these items, you will make your farm less attractive to any rodent. Unfortunately, there are abundance of these items in poultry houses. However, there are things that a farmer should be doing that will make the house a whole lot less attractive. So it's important to keep the grass short. Rodents try to avoid areas where they're exposed and can be taken by predators, and therefore short grass is a must. Remove any rubbish from around the house as well. Manure heaps are attractants to rodents. They like to burrow into them and to make nests, and they provide protection to the rodents. So removal of manure on a regular basis is a great assistance in removing the rodents. Houses should have clear aprons around the buildings. This also again takes away the protection that the rodent has from predators. Removal of feed spillage that attracts rodents is important. Holes in houses that allow rodents to enter should be blocked up. All of these things, you will notice, are things that you can do without using poisons. And this is where we generally start our rodent control, is with these types of issues. So there are two components to a good rodent control program. The one is a site map, which shows where all the bait stations are situated. And ideally, on a site map, you would want the bait stations to be labeled sequentially. It is also a good idea to place bait stations on the perimeter of the site, especially where the site is surrounded by fields and the site itself is going to attract rodents. You will also see on this particular site map that there are activity boxes or bait stations on the outside of the house and on the inside. The activity stations or bait stations on the outside are important because the rodents will encounter these bait stations before they enter the house where there's an abundant feed source. So it is preferable to make sure that you have on both inside and outside the house. In the case where the birds are on the floor and might have access to the bait stations on the inside of the house may be omitted. The placement of bait stations, there are two factors that will control that. The one is that the bait stations need to be fairly close together. We normally work with about 15 meters between bait stations, and the reason for that will be explained when we talk about rodenticides. The other thing that will influence the location of the bait stations is obviously the activity in the house. So if a particular bait station has very high activity, it may be necessary to place additional bait stations close by. And if there's never any activity on a particular bait station, then there's really no point in placing the bait station. So these really are the permanent bait stations. Action should always be taken when one can see that a particular part of the site may be attractive to rodents. So you may find, in fact, that you see a whole lot of burrows, and the burrows need to be poisoned and blocked. If there is a lot of activity in the roof, then it may be necessary to open up the roof and to spray a rodenticide into the roof to deal with that particular problem. If you have exclusively an issue with roof rats, then you need to station your bait stations higher up and not on the ground. All of these things will then determine how you plan your rodent control. The second component of a rodent control program is a documented evidence of what you do with respect to your bait stations. So it's of no use whatsoever to have bait stations and not rebait and not record activity. So you'll see in this particular simple example that I've given you that we have 7 bait stations. Number 1 has very high activity, and so does number 5. And the action that is recorded is clean and rebait. It's very important to clean your bait stations and to place fresh bait in them when the bait is either dirty or has been nibbled by rodents. So rats are quite fastidious and they won't eat dirty bait. So it's important to keep the bait clean and to make sure there's plenty of bait there. There's also a place on the form then for a signature, and this allows for there to be some kind of control. So these are the important parts of a rodent control program, and certainly if you're dealing with FSSC 22000 or one of those types of plans, you will be asked for these kind of documentation. So when we use poison, we normally put it into bait stations, and it's extremely important that it be placed in secure bait stations because rodenticides, or poison that kills rodents, will also kill children and pets and wildlife. So the bait stations need to be secure and they need to be tamper-proof. In other words, only the rodents should be going into the bait station. So the black box type of rodent bait station, which you see on the right-hand side, is the most common, and it provides a very secure environment in which to put the poison. It also, because it's black, attracts rodents into the box. As a rule of thumb with all bait stations, the bait stations need to be clean, they need not to smell of other rodents, and the bait needs to be fresh. If any one of these things is lacking, the rats will avoid the box and will not use it. Rats are notoriously suspicious creatures, and they take a while to get used to a bait station. So moving your bait stations around, if you're trying to poison rats, is really not a good idea, but keeping them clean and keeping the rodenticide fresh is an excellent idea. The other type of rodent control or rodent bait station is the PVC pipe type affair. The disadvantage of this type of pipe is that it becomes easily waterlogged if there's rain, and the poison can often end up on the ground and contaminate your ground. Nonetheless, it can be quite effective, and it's made more effective by using a wire in the middle of the pipe to secure the bait. Liquid bait station, like seen below, are for use purely when the house is empty. I do not recommend the use of liquid bait when the birds are in the house because it's very easy for this to spill. It's very easy for birds to access it and become poisoned. So my preference is to use liquid bait when the birds are out the house and it's downtime. Incidentally, the downtime in a house is the best time to deal with rodent control. There is no other feed available, and so the rodents will be hungry, and this is the time when you can effectively get your rodent control going. Rodenticides are those poisons that kill rodents. They are toxic, therefore one should use gloves. The gloves also prevent the poison from acquiring the smell of a person, which would cause the rodents to avoid them. So there are a number of rodenticides available. In general, the anticoagulants and the non-anticoagulants are the main kinds. Anticoagulants are poisons that cause the rat to bleed to death. They take a while to work in general. The first generation type, which includes the warfarin, are older ones, and there is significant resistance to them, and therefore that was why the second generation anticoagulants were developed. The non-anticoagulant rodenticides tend to be single-dose anticoagulants, and that does have the advantage that the rodents do not have to eat for 7 to 10 days before they get enough poison to die. So rodenticides also come as wax blocks. The wax helps to prevent damage by water. They come as liquids. As I've said previously, liquids should only be used in the downtime. It can be quite useful to mix the liquid rodenticide with something like sherry to increase its attractiveness to rodents. And there's also some that come as tracking powders. Tracking powders are very useful to use in burrows, and it's also useful to use in the roofs of houses where there's a problem with roof rats. There also are a grain bait that's available as well. So there are a number of options. It's important to change rodenticides from time to time, as there can be a development of resistance. There is some confusion about whether a person needs to be a pest control operator to bait rodent bait stations on a farm. So Act 36 of 1947, which is the Agricultural Remedies and Stock Remedies Act, sets out the requirements for registration of pest control operators. And it's quite clear that you do have to be registered if you are operating a pest control business for gain. And therein lies the importance. So if you are going to do this for money, then you need to be registered. If, however, you are instructing your worker to go around and bait stations, this is something that is not controlled by the law. Also be aware that certain types of poisons are only available to people who are registered. However, this is really beyond the scope of the average poultry farmer. Rodent control programs fail when there's not enough bait stations, when the bait stations are not well placed, when the bait stations are not regularly serviced, and when the wrong bait is used. It takes time and effort to address issues of rodent control. It's absolutely important to have some kind of a background rodent control program in place, because at certain times of the year, the rodent population can and will explode and cause significant damage and significant disease.